The deed was a lie. Gertrude Beckett had known it the moment she pressed her thumb to the faded ink and felt the paper give in a way that fresh contracts never did. She had not said a word then, standing in the dusty front parlor of her father's ranch house, with the stranger's dark eyes fixed on her like he was waiting for her to miss something. She had not flinched, had not let so much as a flicker of recognition cross her face, because she had spent 24 years learning how to be invisible inside her own intelligence. She had smiled, set the document down on the oak table beside her father's bourbon glass, and said she needed to fetch more water. Abraham Morgan watched her go. He had ridden into Harlan County, Texas, in early October of 1882 with a name nobody recognized, a horse nobody had seen before, and a leather satchel that clinked too quietly for a man who claimed to be carrying official land papers. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in a way that made doorframes look like suggestions, with a jaw that had been broken once and healed slightly crooked, and eyes so dark they swallowed the available light in whatever room he entered. He had the particular stillness of a man who had learned to survive by not being noticed, which was an extraordinary quality to possess when your physical presence announced itself 3 seconds before you arrived anywhere. He had come to sell the Beckett family their own land. That was the trap. That was the hidden motive that Gertrude had begun to feel from the first syllable he had spoken to her father, Elias Beckett, who was 61 years old and who had suffered a stroke the previous winter that had left his left hand trembling, and his trust in strangers considerably more generous than it had ever been before. The dark past of the land itself was tangled and old, full of the kind of bureaucratic violence that had plagued Texas land titles since before annexation. Elias had homesteaded this land in 1851, built the ranch from creek-bottom sod, raised cattle, lost his wife to fever in 1872, and raised his daughter alone in the aftermath. But the deed of record was messy, clouded by an old survey dispute, and a man with the right forged documents and a lawyer in his pocket could theoretically walk into a Harlan County courthouse and claim 3,000 acres of Beckett Range as his own. Abraham Morgan, it seemed, was that man. Except Gertrude had seen the forgery in under 4 minutes. She stood now at the kitchen pump, the cold October water running over her hands, her heart doing something furious and unauthorized inside her chest. The betrayal was clinical and calculated. The danger was absolutely real. If her father signed those transfer documents, which he had been embarrassingly close to doing before she intervened with the excuse of hospitality and warm coffee, then the Beckett family would lose everything. The ranch, the cattle, the water rights, the house her father had built with his own cracked hands. Everything. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and she thought. She had learned land surveying and deed law out of pure necessity. After the stroke, Elias could no longer ride to verify boundary stakes, and the county surveyor charged $12 per visit, money the ranch rarely had in liquid form during dry years. So Gertrude had bought a second-hand copy of White's Surveying for the American Frontier from a traveling bookseller in 1880, and then a legal text on Texas property law. And then she had written letters to the land office in Austin, until a sympathetic clerk named Henderson had started writing back with answers to her questions about title chains and grant boundaries, and the specific language that distinguished a genuine Republic of Texas original grant from a fraudulent one. She had spent 2 winters reading by oil lamp after her father fell asleep, and she had become, without official title or recognized credential, one of the sharpest minds on land law in Harlan County. She knew what a real deed looked like. She knew the paper weight, the ink quality, the specific clerical abbreviations that the Republic of Texas Land Office had used before 1845. She knew that the document Abraham Morgan had presented, which claimed to be an original 1849 grant superseding her father's 1851 homestead claim, had been printed on paper that was too smooth and too white, and that the abbreviations in the legal description were wrong by a decade. Whoever had forged it had been skilled, but not skilled enough. The question was not whether she had caught him. The question was what she intended to do about it. She filled the coffee pot, dried her hands on her apron, and walked back into the parlor with her mind already building the architecture of a response. Elias Beckett was leaning forward in his armchair with the expression of a man who had decided to like someone before he had adequate reason to. He was a tall man gone angular in old age, with white hair combed flat and a mustache that still carried a little of its original copper color at the corners. He was not a foolish man by nature. The stroke had simply made him more susceptible to the particular warmth that confident strangers could project. Abraham Morgan sat across from him with his hat on his knee and his satchel at his feet, and he was watching Gertrude come through the doorway with an expression she could not entirely read. It was not guilt. It was not triumph. It was something more complicated than either, which surprised her, because she had already decided he was simply a criminal, and criminals were easier to manage when they were simple. She set the coffee pot on the stone trivet and began to pour. "Your survey reads from Comanche Spring as a baseline," she said, pleasantly, to nobody in particular. "Which spring exactly? The upper tributary or the seasonal pool at the base of the ridge?" A beat of silence. "The upper tributary," Abraham said, without hesitation, which meant he had studied the land carefully enough to know it existed, which told her something important about the nature of his plan. "That's interesting," Gertrude said, handing her father his cup. "Because the 1849 grant language you have written there uses the term permanent water source, and the upper tributary of Comanche Spring runs dry from June through September most years. A Republic of Texas surveyor operating in 1849 would have known that. They would have used the lower pool as the baseline marker. They always did." The silence that followed had weight. She watched Abraham Morgan's jaw change. She watched his dark eyes move from the document on the table to her face, and she saw him arrive at an understanding of what was happening, and she watched him decide in real time how to respond to it. She had expected denial. She had expected charm deployed like a weapon. What she had not expected was that he would set his hat down very carefully on the arm of his chair, lean forward with his elbows on his knees, and say, quietly, "How long have you known?" Elias Beckett made a sound. He reached for the document himself, and Gertrude touched his wrist gently, and he stilled, trusting her the way he always trusted her when she used that particular tone of touch. "Since the moment you put it on the table," Gertrude said. Abraham Morgan looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. "You should have said something," he said. "I wanted to understand the full shape of it first," she replied. "Who sent you? And don't insult me by saying you came up with this scheme on your own, because a man who rides into a county alone, without a lawyer in his pocket or a deputy in his back pocket, with a forged deed and no visible support, is not the architect of this plan. He is the instrument of it." Something shifted in his face. It was subtle, the particular micro-expression of a man who had just been seen more clearly than he had prepared for, and it was followed almost immediately by the wall going back up. But she had caught it, that half-second of exposure, and she filed it away. "You're asking me to confess to fraud," he said. "I'm asking you to tell me who is actually trying to steal my father's land," she said, "so that I can address the problem at its source rather than its surface." Elias had gone very quiet. He was looking at his daughter with the expression he sometimes wore when she did something that reminded him of her mother, a woman who had reportedly been able to split a dollar coin at 50 yards with a Henry rifle, which was not a skill that Gertrude had inherited, but which suggested that formidable women ran in some lineage she had access to. Abraham Morgan stood up from his chair. He was very large in the low-ceilinged room, and for a moment Gertrude felt the spatial reality of the situation. The way the nearest firearm was her father's Winchester leaning against the wall 7 feet behind her, and the way the door was behind Abraham and he was between her and it. But she kept her face neutral because fear, like knowledge, was more useful when it was private. "I'll go," he said. "You will not," she said. He stopped. "If you leave, you will report back to whoever sent you that the Beckett deed has a problem, and they will send someone else with a better forgery, or they will find another approach entirely. If you stay and talk to me, there is a possibility that we resolve this without the county sheriff, without lawyers, and without whatever trouble would find you if the man who sent you learned you had failed." She watched him process this. She watched him recognize that she had just offered him something that functioned as protection, which she had not technically promised but which she had implied, and she watched him decide whether to trust the implication. He sat back down. "My father's name is Elias Beckett," she said, "and I am Gertrude Beckett, and this is our land. Now, talk." His name was Abraham Morgan, and that part at least was true. He had been born in 1855 in a small settlement outside San Antonio, the third son of a German immigrant father and a Mexican mother who had died when he was 4 years old. He had grown up speaking 3 languages imperfectly and belonging to no particular community with any completeness, which had given him a certain freedom of movement and a certain homelessness of identity that had made him useful to various people over the years for various purposes. He had been a cattle drover, a freight hauler, a scout for a land speculation company out of Galveston, and for the last 8 months, a man employed by someone he would not yet name to identify distressed land titles and facilitate their transfer through documents he had not personally forged but had agreed to present. He told Gertrude this slowly, over the course of an hour, with the particular precision of a man choosing each word with surgical care. He told her the shape of the scheme without telling her the name at its center. He told her that the Beckett property was one of 4 ranches in Harlan County that had been identified as vulnerable. He told her that the plan was larger than a single land grab, that it was connected to a railroad survey that had not yet been publicly announced, and that whoever owned the land along the proposed route between Comanche Spring Ridge and the eastern county line would be sitting on real estate that a railroad company would pay enormously to acquire. He told her that the Beckett land sat directly in the middle of that corridor. Gertrude listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed and her mind moving at a speed that had no outward expression. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Coleman Vass." Abraham Morgan went very still. "The land speculation company in Galveston that you used to work for," she said. "It was Coleman Vass's operation. And you still work for someone connected to it. The railroad survey was filed with the Texas Land Office 3 months ago under a subsidiary name. I read about it in the Austin Statesman. I wrote to Henderson at the land office. He confirmed the survey corridor last month. I just didn't know yet why it mattered to us specifically." She watched Abraham Morgan look at her with an expression that she would think about for a long time afterward. It was not the expression of a man who had been outmaneuvered exactly. It was the expression of a man who had just seen something he had not known existed, like discovering a river on a map that everyone else had missed. "Henderson," he said slowly. "The land office clerk." "He's been very helpful," she said. "He writes long letters." Elias Beckett made a sound that in a younger man might have been a laugh. He was looking at his daughter with open pride and the slightly dazed expression of a man who had raised someone who had surpassed him without his entirely noticing when it had happened. "Coleman Vass," Abraham said, and his voice had gone flat and cold in a way that told Gertrude the name was not just an employer to him. There was something older and darker behind it, something that had the particular texture of personal damage. "How much do you know about him?" "I know he runs a land speculation operation out of Galveston," she said. "I know he has courthouse connections in at least 3 counties. I know he employs men like you to do the work that requires a presentable face and a satchel of forged documents." "Men like me," Abraham said. "I don't mean that as an insult," she said, and then stopped because she looked at his face and saw that she might have meant it partially and that she was capable of being more precise than that. "I mean men who need money and are good at managing people's attention, which is a skill a neutral one. He looked at her for a long moment. "You are a very unusual woman. I am a woman who intends to keep her father's ranch," she said. "What would it take for you to tell me Coleman Vass's full name and his Galveston address, and to provide me with whatever documentation you have about the railroad scheme? Why would I do that? Because you are sitting in my father's house and you have not left, and that means part of you is already considering it." The silence stretched. Outside, the October wind moved through the live oaks along the fence line, and a cow somewhere in the far pasture called once and was answered, and the oil lamp on the side table shifted its flame without cause. "He'll know it was me," Abraham said. "Yes," Gertrude said, "he will. That carries consequences." "I expect it does," she said. "Which means that whatever you do next, you should do it fully, not halfway. A man who betrays Coleman Vass halfway ends up in a worse position than a man who does it completely." Abraham Morgan looked at his hands for a moment. They were large hands, calloused at the rope lines and scarred across the knuckles in a way that suggested a history of difficult work and occasional violence. Then he looked up at her and said, "What are you offering?" And this was the moment she had been building toward since she had recognized the forgery, since she had understood the shape of the threat, since she had decided not to reach for the Winchester and not to send for the sheriff, and instead to do something that required more precision than either of those responses. "Time," she said, "and information, and someone who already knows the land law and the county recorder's office and the land office clerk in Austin. Someone who can help you file a complaint about the scheme with the Texas Attorney General's office before Coleman Vass realizes what's happening. If you're a witness rather than a defendant, your position changes considerably." She watched him think about this for a long time. Then he said, "The man's full name is Coleman Raleigh Vass. He operates out of an office on Strand Street in Galveston. His lawyer is a man named Prout, Ambrose Prout, who has connections to 2 circuit court judges. The other 3 ranches he's targeting in Harlan County are the Morrison Place east of the river, the Hendricks Homestead on the South Ridge, and the old Calhoun grant that old man Calhoun's widow has been running alone since 1878. Gertrude stood up and went to her father's writing desk and took out paper and a pen, and she began to write it all down. She wrote for a long time, and Abraham talked, and Elias Beckett sat in his armchair and drank his coffee and watched his daughter dismantle a land fraud scheme with the same concentrated focus with which she did everything, which was to say completely and without visible emotion, and with the particular efficiency of someone who had decided the thing was going to be done and had moved on to the question of how. When they were finished, Abraham Morgan stood and picked up his hat and his satchel. "You should stay," Elias Beckett said, which surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He cleared his throat. "Road back to town is dark. We have a bunkhouse." Abraham looked at Gertrude. She looked at the papers on the desk, and then at the man standing in her father's parlor with his hat in his hands, and she said, "The bunkhouse is clean and the cook stove works." He stayed. The next morning came in gray and cold, the way Texas Octobers sometimes do when the norther has decided to arrive ahead of schedule. And Gertrude was up before the sun, because she was always up before the sun, moving through the kitchen with the lamp burning low and the coffee already started, and her mind already 2 steps ahead of the day. She had the papers she had written the night before spread on the kitchen table when she heard the bunkhouse door, and then boots on the porch boards, and then Abraham Morgan knocked twice on the kitchen doorframe before he came in, which was unexpected. Men who had something to apologize for either avoided you entirely or came in without announcing themselves to demonstrate that they felt they had the right. He knocked, which was something else. She poured him coffee without asking. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at the papers she had laid out, and she watched him take in what she had organized overnight, which was a full accounting of the scheme with named parties, supporting evidence, timeline, and a draft complaint letter to the Texas Attorney General that used the specific statutory language that Henderson had mentioned in his last letter as being most likely to trigger a formal investigation. "When did you sleep?" he asked. "I'll sleep in December," she said. He looked at the letter for a long time. "You know Texas property law well enough to write this." "I know it well enough that it won't be dismissed as amateur," she said. "Whether the Attorney General acts on it depends on factors I don't control, but the filing itself will be a matter of public record, which creates a different kind of pressure." "Vass has contacts in state government," Abraham said. "He has contacts in some places," she said. "But the Texas Attorney General's office has been actively looking for a large land fraud case since the Hooper scandal last year. An organized scheme targeting railroad corridor land with forged Republic of Texas grants is exactly the kind of case that makes a career. They will be motivated." He was looking at her with that expression again. Not quite awe, because it was too steady for awe, but something adjacent to it, something that had the quality of attention a person gives to something they have decided they cannot afford to stop watching. "You've been thinking about this for months," he said, "before I arrived." "I've been thinking about the railroad corridor since Henderson's letter in September," she said. "I didn't know how the threat would arrive. Now I do." She looked up from the papers and met his eyes directly, which she had been doing with comfortable frequency that already felt like something, felt like a habit forming, which she noted and set aside because there was a great deal to do before she had the luxury of thinking about what Abraham Morgan's eyes were like in morning light. "I need you to ride back to Galveston," she said. "Not immediately, but within 2 weeks. I need you to collect whatever documentation you have access to about the scheme. Correspondence, payment records, survey maps, anything that shows Vass's direction and intent. I need you to be a witness who shows up with evidence, not just a participant who shows up with a story. If I go back to Galveston," he said, "there's a chance Vass gets word that something went wrong here and pulls me in before I can leave again. Then we need to be faster than he expects," she said. He drank his coffee. He looked at the table between them. He looked like a man who was making a decision that had more dimensions than the immediate practical one, and she respected that he was being thorough about it. "What do you get out of this?" he said. "Beyond saving the ranch." "The other 3 families," she said. "The Morrisons, the Hendrickses, Widow Calhoun. They don't know they're targeted. They need to." "That's not what I mean," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know what you mean." "Then answer it." "I don't lose things," she said simply. "That is my primary characteristic. My father built this land and my mother died on it, and I have managed it for 6 years since his stroke, and I will not allow a man in Galveston who has never stood on Texas soil to take it from us by way of paper. That's what I get out of it. The satisfaction of the thing not being lost." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I had a mother." She waited. "She had land," he said, "outside San Antonio. She had inherited it from her own mother, a Spanish land grant, which should have been protected under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It wasn't. Men came with papers when I was 9 years old, and she didn't know how to read the papers, and nobody helped her, and we left." Gertrude looked at him. She looked at him properly, the way she sometimes forgot to let herself do, taking in the full weight of what he had just said and what it meant about the shape of his life. "That's why Vass could recruit you," she said, not as an accusation. "A man who needs money is useful," he said. "A man who has a reason to need money is more useful because he works harder. And then he becomes something he didn't intend to become," she said. "Yes," Abraham said. The words sat there between them, simple and exposed. "You are not beyond correction," Gertrude said. "That is also my opinion, for what it's worth." He looked at her for a long time. "It's worth something," he said. "I am not entirely sure what yet." The weeks that followed were not simple. Abraham Morgan stayed at the Beckett Ranch, which required explanation to the 2 ranch hands, Dex and Julio, who were both loyal to the family in the particular fierce, uncomplicated way of men who had been paid honestly for years and who had opinions about strangers. Gertrude told them the truth, which was her general policy, and she watched Dex's jaw tighten and Julio's hand move toward his belt knife, and she said, clearly and once, "He is helping us now, and that is what matters, And if either of you has a problem with my judgment on that, say so directly and we'll discuss it." They did not say so directly. Abraham began to earn his way. He was good with the cattle in a way that suggested actual knowledge rather than performance, and he could repair fence line faster than Dex, which Dex acknowledged with a silence that was its own kind of respect. He was quiet in the evenings, and he ate at the table when Gertrude's father invited him, which Elias did with increasing frequency as the old man decided he liked the company. Elias Beckett was not a foolish man, but he was a man who had been lonely for a long time, and Abraham Morgan had a quality of stillness that the older man found restful. They would sit on the porch after supper in the cold evenings with their tobacco and their bourbon, and talk about cattle prices and weather patterns and the old days of the Republic. And Gertrude would sometimes watch them from the kitchen window and feel something complicated and warm happening in the lower part of her chest. She was not a woman who had spent much time on romantic feelings. There had been a young man in town, the schoolteacher's son, when she was 19, and it had been pleasant and brief, and had ended when he had tried to explain to her why women weren't suited to understanding law, after which the romance had become structurally untenable. There had been nobody since, because the ranch demanded everything, and she had not felt the lack acutely, until the large man with the crooked jaw had begun splitting firewood in her yard every morning at dawn, and drinking his coffee in her kitchen and looking at her like she was a map of something he was trying to learn. She wrote to Henderson in Austin and set the legal strategy in motion. She rode to the Morrison Ranch, 8 miles east, and sat across from Calvin Morrison's wife, a sharp woman named Ruth, and told her what was coming. Ruth went pale and then got angry in a way that was deeply satisfying to watch. Gertrude rode to the Hendricks place and told the same story to Tom Hendricks, who rode immediately to Widow Calhoun without being asked. Within 2 weeks, all 4 families knew the shape of the threat. Abraham rode to Galveston. He had been gone 3 days when Gertrude started being honest with herself about the fact that she had noticed his absence as a specific weight, a particular quality of quietness in the house that was different from ordinary quietness. She did not like this realization precisely because it was inconvenient. She sat with it in the practical way she sat with most inconvenient things, turning it over until she understood its dimensions. And what she understood was that Abraham Morgan had arrived in her house as a threat and had become something else entirely, something that she had not planned for, and that did not fit neatly into the categories she had previously used to organize her experience of other people. He came back on the 6th day with a canvas satchel full of papers and a bruise across his left cheekbone that he declined to explain in detail. She stood in the yard when he rode in and looked at the bruise and said, "Did you get what you needed?" "Yes," he said. "Then come inside." She cleaned the cut at his hairline herself, because Elias was resting, and she was the one who had always handled the medical necessities on the ranch. Abraham sat very still while she worked with the iodine and the cloth, which she appreciated, because men who flinched away from necessary pain were tiresome. He was close enough that she could see the exact details of the break in his jaw, the way it had healed with a slight leftward deviation that, in some lighting, gave his profile a quality of striking imperfection that she found she had formed a specific opinion about. "Vass suspects something," he said, while she pressed the cloth to his temple. "What does he know?" "That I haven't reported back from Harlan County and that I'm not answering his messages. One of his men came to my room at the boarding house. We had a disagreement, a physical one, briefly. And the papers, everything, correspondence from Vass to his lawyer naming the 4 properties and the railroad connection, a surveyor's map with the proposed route marked, payment records that tie the forged documents to a print shop in Houston that Vass owns through a subsidiary." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper separately from the satchel. "And this." A letter from Vass to one of the circuit judges, the one connected to Prout, asking him to hold a specific courtroom date open in December for what he describes as the Harlan County property resolutions. Gertrude read the letter. Then she read it again. "This is enough," she said. "I thought so. This is more than enough. This is the complete structure of the conspiracy in one document." She set it down carefully on the table. "Abraham," he looked at her. She was still standing very close to him from the medical work, close enough that the distance between them was a choice rather than a default. "You did not have to go back there," she said. "You could have simply left. Ridden west and let this be someone else's problem." "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, serious eyes, and then he said, "Because you asked me to do something that mattered and I wanted to do it." She held his gaze. "That's not all of it." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She stepped back because she was the kind of woman who needed room to think, and she thought for approximately 4 seconds, which was enough, and then she said, "We'll ride to the county seat tomorrow and file everything with the recorder's office. I want it on public record before we send the package to Austin so that it can't be suppressed." "All right," he said. "And then we'll need to wait," she said. "Investigations take time." "I know. You should stay," she said, and her voice had a quality she was aware of, something slightly different from the previous time she had used that phrase, something that had nothing to do with practicality. "The horses need looking after and Dex's back has been giving him trouble and my father enjoys your company." "And," Abraham said, she looked at him levelly. "And I would like you to stay," she said. "For my own reasons, which I suspect you can identify without my enumerating them." He looked at her. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for weeks, with that quality of complete attention, and then he said simply, "Yes." They rode to the county seat, Harlan Springs, the next morning, arriving at the courthouse at 9 o'clock when the recorder's office opened. The county recorder was a small, nervous man named Garrett who handled the filed documents with visible anxiety when he understood what he was looking at. Because a conspiracy of this scale, reaching a circuit court judge, was the kind of thing that made county officials quietly rethink their own position and their own exposures. Gertrude was patient with him and precise in her explanation of what each document was and what it demonstrated, and when they left, everything was on record. She sent the package to the Austin office of the Texas Attorney General that same afternoon by express post. Then she sent a personal letter to Henderson. In the following weeks, the investigation moved with what Gertrude considered admirable speed, which she attributed partly to the quality of the evidence and partly to Henderson's effective advocacy within the land office, which had its own institutional reasons for wanting to be seen as responsive to exactly this kind of case. 3 investigators from Austin arrived in Harlan County in November, and they met with all 4 ranch families, and they met with Abraham Morgan for 2 full days of detailed testimony, and they sent their own men to Galveston to serve papers on Coleman Raleigh Vass. Vass hired 4 lawyers and spent a considerable amount of money trying to suppress the investigation. But the letter to the circuit court judge was in the public record at the Harlan County Courthouse, and suppressing a public record required a different kind of judicial courage than Vass's connections were willing to provide. The circuit judge, faced with his own name on a document in a conspiracy investigation, immediately removed himself from anything connected to Vass and cooperated with the investigators. The lawyer Prout, Ambrose Prout, found himself in a similar position and found cooperation to be his preferred strategy. Coleman Raleigh Vass was indicted by a Galveston grand jury in December of 1882 on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and suborning of public officials. It was not a swift trial, because nothing involving lawyers and multiple defendants and a railroad company's political exposure was ever swift. But the indictment meant that the scheme was finished, that the forged deeds had no legal standing anywhere in the state, and that the 4 Harlan County ranches were safe. The day the indictment news arrived, Ruth Morrison rode over to the Beckett ranch with a jar of her apple preserves and threw her arms around Gertrude in the yard, which Gertrude received with some surprise and genuine pleasure. Tom Hendricks sent a letter. Widow Calhoun, whose name was Delia and who had the particular dry humor of a woman who had survived too much to be easily moved, sent a note that said simply, "Well done, Miss Beckett. You are your mother's daughter," which Gertrude suspected was the highest compliment available in Delia Calhoun's vocabulary. Elias Beckett read the news from Austin in the kitchen with his coffee and then sat for a moment in silence, and then said, "Your mother would have been proud," and Gertrude had to look out the window for a moment before she could trust her face. That evening, Abraham Morgan found her at the fence line east of the house where she liked to stand in the evenings to watch the light change on the ridge, because the ridge at sunset in October and November had a quality of color that she had been watching all her life and never found ordinary. He came and stood beside her without saying anything, because he had learned in the weeks of living alongside her that she sometimes required silence to be comfortable, and he was a man who was capable of providing it. "It's done," she said after a while. "It is," he said. "Your testimony was the core of it," she said. "The investigators said as much. Without the Galveston documentation and your account of the scheme's direction, the paper trail alone might not have been sufficient. You built the paper trail," he said. "You made the connections I didn't even know existed. We did it together," she said, which was the most accurate description. He was standing close to her at the fence, close enough that the cold was easier beside him than it would have been alone, which she noted as a physical fact without pretending it was nothing. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I don't have anywhere specific to be," he said. "I don't have land, I don't have a home that's mine. I've been moving since I was 9 years old and I've gotten very good at it and I've been telling myself for a long time that I prefer it." He paused. "I have recently begun to revise that assessment." Gertrude looked at the ridge. "You are telling me," she said carefully, "that you are considering stopping." "I am telling you," he said, "that I am considering this place specifically, if there were a reason to stop here specifically." She turned to look at him then, the full direct look that she gave to things that required her full direct attention, and she said, "What kind of reason would be sufficient?" He looked at her. The sunset light was doing something complicated to the side of his face, gold on the crooked jaw and the dark eyes, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was the most arresting-looking person she had encountered in her 24 years, by which she meant not simply that he was handsome, though he was, but that he commanded attention in a way that had to do with the whole particular combination of him, the stillness and the size, and the intelligence that moved quietly behind his eyes. "I think you know," he said. "I want to hear it said," she replied. He turned to face her properly. "Gertrude," she waited. "I came here to deceive your family, and I ended up watching you take apart a fraud scheme with the precision of a surgeon, and I have spent 6 weeks being more alive in one place than I have been in 15 years of moving, and I would like to stay here because you are here, and I would like that to be a permanent arrangement if you are willing." She considered this for a moment. She looked at him seriously and he looked back, and neither of them moved. "You understand," she said, "that permanent means permanent. This ranch is my life's work. My father is here. The land is here. I am not a woman who can be carried off somewhere more convenient." "I know," he said. "And you understand that I have opinions and I will express them, and that I make decisions about things in my competency without waiting to be given permission. I have been watching you do that for 6 weeks," he said. "It is not a deterrent." "Some men find it one," she said. "Some men," Abraham said quietly, "have not had the education of spending 6 weeks watching you work." She smiled then, a real smile, the kind she didn't produce often and therefore had a particular quality when it appeared. She turned back to the ridge for a moment and then turned back to him and said, "I have been thinking about you for weeks also, in case the asymmetry worried you." "It did," he said. "It shouldn't have," she said. I'm merely careful about what I say until I am certain of what I mean." "And now?" he asked. "Now I am certain," she said. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the top fence rail, slowly and carefully, as if he were lifting something that required both steadiness and attention. She let him. His hand was very warm and very large, and the specific quality of the contact was something she was going to spend time thinking about later. In the careful, systematic way she thought about things she wanted to understand fully. "Gertrude," he said again, quietly, just her name, and the way he said it had a quality of arrival, of someone coming to a place they had been a long time finding. "Abraham," she said. They stood at the fence until the light was completely gone from the ridge, their hands together on the cold fence rail. The winter of 1882 going into 1883 was not a soft one. The norther that had been threatening since October arrived in full force in December and put 2 feet of snow on the ridge, which was not unheard of in Texas hill country, but was not common either, and the cattle had to be brought closer to the home pasture and fed from the stored hay, and there were 3 weeks in January when the temperature did not get above freezing during the day. The work was hard and constant, and Gertrude and Abraham did it together, side by side in the cold, and it turned out that this was a useful test of whether two people actually suited each other, because romantic feeling was one thing, and being able to work a fence line together in a blizzard was another. They suited each other. There was a particular afternoon in late January when a young steer broke through the ice at the pond's edge and went in, and getting him out required rope work and judgment about the ice thickness and a willingness to go partially into the freezing water. And Abraham went in without hesitation and managed the rope and the steer with the particular skill of someone who had handled cattle his entire life. And Gertrude read the ice and directed the angles with the particular precision of someone who had been solving physical problems on this land for years. The steer survived. They were both soaked to the knee and shaking with cold by the time they got back to the house, and Elias had a fire going and blankets, and was not asking any of the questions that were visible on his face. That night, after Elias had gone to bed, Gertrude and Abraham sat by the fire and she told him about her mother. She had not talked about her mother in a long time, not in this detailed way, not about the specific quality of her voice, or the way she had laughed, or the way the house had been different with her in it, and emptier in a way that was physical after she was gone. Abraham listened to all of it without moving, with that particular quality of attention he had, and when she had finished he said, "My mother used to sing in Spanish in the morning. I don't remember the words. I remember the sound of it." They sat with that for a while. "Tell me about the land she lost," Gertrude said gently. He told her. He told her more than he had told anyone in a long time, the shape of the property outside San Antonio, the quality of the light there, the way the live oaks had grown along a particular creek, the fact that the deed should have been protected and wasn't, and that the men who had come with papers had spoken to his mother in English only, knowing she read primarily in Spanish, and that nobody had been held accountable for any of it. "That's a specific injustice," Gertrude said. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was explicit about property protection. "Explicit and enforced are two different things," he said. "Yes," she said, "they are." She was quiet for a moment. "Is there a chain of title?" He looked at her. "What? For the land? Is there a chain of title you could follow? If the original grant was valid and the dispossession was illegal, there may be a record that still exists." He stared at her. "That was 30 years ago. Texas land records go back to the Republic period," she said, "and Spanish grant records go back further. Henderson would know how to trace it. If the dispossession was illegal, it could theoretically be challenged even now, depending on how subsequent title was established." He was very quiet. "I'm not promising anything," she said carefully. "The law in practice and the law as written are different animals, but I can write to Henderson. I can find out what the record shows." Abraham Morgan looked at her across the fire. "Why would you do that?" he said, and his voice had something in it she had not heard before, something that was not quite steady. "Because it is a wrong that should be righted if it can be," she said. "And because it matters to you." She met his eyes. "And because I intend to spend a considerable amount of time in your company going forward, and I would like you to be whole if that is achievable." He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Gertrude, yes, I am going to need to tell you something I have not said to another person in a very long time." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to find a practical framing for it for several weeks because I thought that would be better received. And I have concluded that there is no practical framing because it is simply true in a way that does not need framing. I love you, and I want to stay here, and I want to help you with this ranch and your father, and whatever you decide to do next, because everything you do is worth watching and being near, and I am done moving." Gertrude looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the fire and then back at him. "I have been careful my whole life about what I say until I mean it completely," she said. "So you understand that when I say I love you also, it is not a thing I say quickly or without certainty." "I know," he said. "I love you," she said. "I have been fairly sure of it since you came back from Galveston with a bruise on your face and a satchel full of evidence, and I became certain of it sometime in January when you went into the ice pond after that steer." He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, full and warm, and she had heard him laugh before, but not quite like this, not with this quality of relief in it, and she found that she liked it very much. "The steer," he said. "The steer convinced me you were serious," she said. He reached across and took her hand again, the way he had at the fence line in October, with that careful steadiness, and she turned her hand over and held his properly. "All right," she said. "Now that we are both clear." "Now that we are both clear," he agreed. Spring came slowly and then all at once, the way Texas springs do, and the ranch came back to life in the particular vigorous way of land that has weathered something difficult and arrived on the other side. The cattle were healthy. The hay stores had held. Two of the heifers who had been bred in autumn were visibly pregnant, and Julio identified this development with the proprietary pride of a man who had managed the breeding records and wanted credit. Abraham had begun, with Gertrude's involvement and Henderson's research, the process of tracing his mother's San Antonio land grant through the Texas archives. Henderson had found the original Spanish grant document, which predated Texas statehood and was a matter of record in both the Texas Land Office and the Federal General Land Office. The chain of title after the dispossession was murky, which cut both ways, because it meant that subsequent owners had not established clean title either. Henderson wrote that a land attorney in San Antonio, a man named Escobedo who specialized in old grant cases, thought there was a viable claim. Gertrude read this letter twice at the kitchen table and then looked at Abraham and said, "Go to San Antonio, talk to Escobedo." "The spring work is," he began. "Dex and Julio can manage the spring work for 2 weeks," she said. "This matters." He went. He came back 3 weeks later with a legal agreement and the slightly dazed expression of a man who has been told something he had stopped believing was possible. The case was not simple, and it would take time, and the land had been sold twice since the dispossession, meaning the path to recovery was complicated. But Escobedo believed that a negotiated settlement with the current owners, who were themselves not entirely comfortable with the cloudiness of their title, was achievable. A financial settlement in lieu of physical land return was the most likely outcome, but it was something. It was acknowledgement and compensation for a specific injustice that had been ignored for 30 years. Gertrude watched Abraham's face when he described this, and she saw what the possibility of it meant to him, the particular kind of healing that comes from a wrong being seen even when it cannot be fully undone. "Escobedo's fee?" she asked. "He's working on contingency," Abraham said. "Good man," she said. In April, Gertrude Beckett sat down with Abraham Morgan at the kitchen table, and had a conversation that Gertrude was not present for, which she learned about afterward from her father's account, and from the way Abraham looked at her for the rest of that day. Elias had told Abraham, apparently with the directness of a man his age who had concluded there was no useful benefit to indirection, that he was not a young man, and that his health was uncertain, and that the ranch needed a future, and that his daughter was the most capable and finest person he had ever known, and that any man who wanted a role in her life would have to be very clear about what he intended and whether he was capable of deserving her. Abraham had apparently told Elias about his mother's land and the dispossession, and his own dark past of being used by men like Vass, and he had told him that he intended to stay and to be useful, and to do whatever Gertrude needed him to do, in whatever form she wanted, for as long as she would have him. He had said it, by Elias' account, without performance or decoration, which was the kind of honesty that Elias Beckett had always responded to. Elias had shaken his hand and offered him bourbon. Abraham proposed to Gertrude in May, at the fence line where they had first held hands, which she appreciated as a choice of location, because it demonstrated a quality of sentimental attention that she had not expected in a man of his particular profile, and was pleasantly surprised by. He had a ring, which he had bought in town, a simple gold band with a small stone garnet, the red of the Texas sunset color she liked. He held it in his large calloused hand and told her that he wanted to marry her and stay on this land and work beside her and build a life that had a specific location on the earth, and he said that she was the most extraordinary person he had encountered, and that he loved her in a way that had changed the way he understood himself. She said yes immediately, which surprised him slightly, because he had been prepared for her to take time. "I told you I was certain," she said. "I thought you might want to think it over," he said. "Abraham," she said patiently, "I think about everything. I have been thinking about this since January. My decision was made in January. I was simply waiting for you to ask me properly." He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed that full, warm laugh, and she stepped forward and kissed him, which she had not done before, which was a significant development, and which was conducted in the full open air of the Texas spring with the sound of cattle in the distance and the live oaks moving in the warm wind. They were married in June of 1883 in the yard of the Beckett Ranch, because the house was not large enough for the assembled guests, and the June day was warm and clear, with the sky that particular brilliant blue that made Texas look like God had made a specific effort. Ruth Morrison and her husband Calvin were there. Tom Hendricks and his family. Delia Calhoun, who wore a black dress that was her best dress and had clearly been pressed for the occasion, and who kissed Gertrude on the cheek and said quietly, "You did everything right, girl." Dex and Julio wore their clean shirts. Henderson had come from Austin, which was unexpected and greatly appreciated. Elias Beckett walked his daughter to the minister with his left hand only trembling a little, and he looked at her with a combination of grief and pride and joy that she understood was about her mother as much as it was about her, about the life her mother had not lived to see, and she squeezed his arm and he stood straight. The minister was a Methodist circuit preacher named Howell who had a loud voice and a genuine warmth, and who performed the ceremony with a particular feeling. Abraham Morgan stood in the June light with his clean shirt and his brushed coat and his crooked jaw and his dark eyes fixed on Gertrude with an expression that had no component of doubt in it whatsoever. And when the vows were spoken, he spoke them the way he did everything that mattered to him, with complete attention and no wasted words. Gertrude wore her mother's dress, which had been kept in cedar, and which fit her almost perfectly with 2 minor alterations she had made herself by lamplight the week before the wedding. She stood in the yard of the ranch her father had built, and she looked at the man she had chosen, and she said her vows with the same precision and certainty she brought to everything she said, and she meant every word of every syllable. Dex produced a fiddle from somewhere that nobody had known he owned, and a man from the Morrison Ranch could play a guitar, and there was dancing in the yard in the long summer evening. And Elias danced with his daughter once and then sat with his bourbon and watched the yard full of people with the expression of a man who has got to see something he needed to see. The summer was good. Abraham was formally recognized as a partner in the ranch's operation, which required some paperwork that Gertrude managed with her usual thoroughness, establishing the legal structure of the arrangement in terms that protected both the property and the partnership from any future ambiguity. Abraham's role with the cattle was formalized and expanded. He had ideas about breeding selection that were based on what he had observed in the hill country south of San Antonio, and Gertrude read about them and researched the current cattle science literature, and they discussed the approach for several evenings before she agreed it was promising and they tried it. Henderson wrote to tell them that the Texas Attorney General's office had secured its first conviction in the Vass case in September of 1883, with Vass himself expected to face trial in the spring. The circuit judge who had been named in the conspiracy letter had been removed from the bench. Prout, the lawyer, had lost his license. The print shop in Houston had been closed. Gertrude wrote back to Henderson thanking him, and in the same letter asked two new questions about historical land deed law in Spanish colonial Texas, because she had agreed to help Delia Calhoun sort out an old title dispute of her own, unrelated to Vass, that had been sitting in unresolved status for 15 years. "You are going to become a land lawyer," Abraham said one evening, watching her read over Delia's deed documents. "I'm not going to become anything official," she said without looking up. "I'm going to help people keep their land." "You could be official," he said. She looked up then. "Women cannot be licensed attorneys in Texas in 1883, she said, "though I understand the situation is different in some territories." "Texas changes," he said. "Texas changes slowly," she said. "But yes, I am watching the situation." She looked at him. "Does it bother you?" "Which part?" "The part where I might do something large and official and public," she said. He looked at her with open incredulity. "Gertrude, I fell in love with you while you were dismantling a fraud scheme at the kitchen table. The large and official and public is not a concern. It is a preference." She looked at him for a moment and felt that warm thing in her chest that she had stopped being surprised by and had begun to simply live inside. "Good," she said, and went back to Delia's deed. In October of 1883, exactly 1 year after Abraham Morgan had ridden into the yard with his forged deed and his leather satchel, Gertrude discovered she was pregnant. She told Abraham in the evening at the fence line, which had become their place for the things that mattered, and he went very still in the way he did when something had landed too large for immediate processing, and then he turned to look at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I am always sure before I say something," she said. He put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her for a long time, and she saw him arrive slowly at the full weight of what she had said, and she watched joy move through him the way light moves through water, complex and warming and reaching every part. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. He pulled her into his arms, which she allowed with particular willingness, and she put her face against his chest and felt the solid reality of him, the warmth and size and steadiness, and thought that she had made the right choice, the best choice, the only choice that had made any sense since the moment she had pressed her thumb to a forged deed and understood that something important was beginning. Elias Beckett received this news with a quality of emotion that required him to go outside and stand by the fence for several minutes before he could trust himself to speak, which was the most emotional she had ever seen him, and when he came back in, he simply hugged his daughter for a long time without saying anything. He was going to be a grandfather. The ranch was going to have a future. The winter was gentler than the last one, which felt appropriate. Abraham had been corresponding steadily with Escobedo in San Antonio, and in December a settlement was reached in the land case. A financial settlement, not full restoration of the original property value, because too much time had passed, and too many subsequent transactions had intervened, but a real and specific amount, formally recognized as compensation for an illegal dispossession. Escobedo's letter describing the settlement used the language of legal remedy, of acknowledgement and correction, and Abraham read it twice at the kitchen table and then sat quietly with it for a while. Gertrude put her hand on his. He turned his over and held it. "Your mother's land," she said. "Part of it," he said. "What could be returned?" "It was seen," she said. "That's what matters. The wrong was seen." "Yes," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to use part of the settlement for the ranch, improve the water infrastructure. That pump at the east pasture has been failing. The rest of it is yours," she said. "The rest of it is ours," he said. "That's what married means." She looked at him. "You are occasionally very wise," she said. "Occasionally," he agreed with that full, warm laugh. The spring of 1884 came in with wildflowers and the sound of new calves in the pasture. And in late April, Gertrude Morgan, formerly Beckett, gave birth to a son in the bedroom of the ranch house with Ruth Morrison, in attendance as the most experienced mother in the community, and a doctor from town who arrived somewhat after the main events, but was helpful with the afterward. Abraham was outside in the yard doing nothing useful for several hours, because it was not possible to be useful inside, and the doing of nothing outside was better than the doing of nothing inside. When Ruth appeared in the doorway and told him to come in, he moved through the house faster than she had ever seen him move. The boy was small and red and completely healthy, and had, Gertrude noted with scientific observation, Abraham's jaw, or at least the suggestion of it, the same broad line of it. She was exhausted in the profound way of women who have just done something enormous with their bodies, and she was also completely awake in a way that had nothing to do with rest, because the person in her arms was new and specific and entirely himself, and she was meeting him for the first time. Abraham sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression that had no description in any language he spoke. "He's real," he said. "He is extremely real," Gertrude agreed. "He's so small," Abraham said with something like alarm. "They start small," she said. "It's the standard arrangement." He looked at her. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with composure, which she found that she loved, the fact that this large, serious, steady man was undone by this small red person. They named him Elias James Morgan. Elias for her father, James for Abraham's own father, who had died when Abraham was 17, and of whom he spoke rarely but with a specific careful quality that she recognized as love that had not had enough time. Elias Beckett held his grandson for the first time with his trembling left hand braced by his steadier right, and he looked down at the baby with an expression that Gertrude thought she would see whenever she closed her eyes for the rest of her life. He said very quietly, Margaret would have loved him, which was her mother's name, and Gertrude said, yes, she would have, and that was all that needed to be said. The Coleman Vass trial concluded in May of 1884 with a conviction on all primary counts. He was sentenced to 12 years in the Texas State Penitentiary. The Galveston Daily News covered it, and Henderson sent Gertrude the clipping with a note that said simply, "Justice, somewhat delayed but arrived." She put the clipping in the document box with all the papers from the original scheme, the forged deed, her handwritten notes from that first evening, Abraham's testimony summary, the Attorney General's correspondence. It was a complete record of a thing that had happened and been resolved. She kept it because records mattered. Abraham's cattle breeding experiment produced results by the second year that justified the approach, with the Beckett-Morgan herd, which was what people in the county had begun calling it informally, showing measurably better weight gain and drought resilience than the surrounding ranches. Tom Hendricks asked Abraham to come look at his herd and offer advice, which he did, and which led to a similar conversation with Calvin Morrison, and which led eventually to Abraham becoming a recognized authority on cattle management in Harlan County, which he accepted with his characteristic quietness, and which Gertrude accepted with overt satisfaction. "I told you," she said one evening. "You tell me a great many things," he said, "and I am right about most of them," she said. "About most of them," he agreed, with his particular quality of mild emphasis that she had learned to recognize as his version of disagreement presented diplomatically. "Which ones am I wrong about?" she asked. "The new fence posts at the south pasture," he said. "Cedar would have been better than pine." She considered this. "You may be right about the south pasture fence posts," she said. "I will note this moment," he said. She threw a dish towel at him, which he caught with the reflexes of a man who had been on the receiving end of various thrown objects and had developed useful response skills. Little Elias, who rapidly became Eli as a practical matter, proved to be a child of considerable energy and considerable curiosity, which his parents found both delightful and exhausting in roughly equal measure. He walked early and talked early and had opinions about everything, which he expressed with a volume that suggested he had perhaps inherited some combination of his grandfather's range and his mother's precision. He followed Abraham around the ranch with complete devotion, which Abraham accepted with a gravity appropriate to the responsibility, teaching the boy the names of things, the handling of animals, the reading of weather. He also followed Gertrude to her desk, where he would sit with his chin in his hands watching her read and write, and one afternoon when he was 3 years old, he pointed at a document she was working on and asked what the letters said, and she told him carefully, word by word, and he listened with complete attention, which she recognized as a quality she was glad he had. In 1885, Gertrude began formally helping neighbors with deed and title questions. It was an informal practice, conducted at her kitchen table, without fee in most cases, with a donation to the household in kind when people felt they needed to give something. Henderson in Austin had become a genuine professional correspondent and friend, and she had by now read a law text on property litigation from cover to cover twice and had begun a second one. She could not call herself a lawyer, but she could tell you what your deed said and what it meant and what your options were, and who to write to in Austin, and in Harlan County in 1885. That was the most useful thing a person with legal knowledge could do. Abraham built her a dedicated room for this work, off the south side of the house, with a proper desk and shelving for her document boxes, and a large window that let in the afternoon light from the ridge. He built it over 2 weekends in October, and when he was done, he put his hand on the doorframe and said, simply, "Your office." And she stood in the middle of it and looked at the light from the ridge falling across the clean desk surface, and felt the particular satisfaction of a life that had shaped itself correctly. She kissed him there in her office with the afternoon light coming in, which he received with the quality of a man who had ceased to be surprised by his luck, but had not ceased to be grateful for it. Elias Beckett's health declined gradually through 1886, which was not unexpected, and which he bore with the particular dignity of a man who has done what he intended to do, and is not afraid of what comes next. He spent his mornings in the yard in good weather and his afternoons in his armchair by the fire, and he had the company of his grandson, who was 4 and who told him stories of considerable creative invention about animals and weather, and the various enterprises of ranch life. He had the company of his son-in-law, with whom he sat evenings on the porch when the weather allowed, and the company of his daughter, who came in every evening before supper without fail and sat with him for an hour and talked about whatever needed talking about: the ranch, the news from Austin, the law, the cattle, the child. One evening in November he said to her, "I want you to know I am satisfied." She looked at him. "With everything," he said, "with the way it went. I was afraid after your mother died that things wouldn't go right, that I wouldn't be enough. And I wasn't in a lot of ways, but you were more than enough. You were more than anything I could have made you." He paused. "And that man out there," he gestured toward the window where they could hear Abraham in the yard with Eli, "he's a good man. He was lost for a while, but he found the right thing." "Yes," Gertrude said. "Your mother found me when I was lost too," Elias said. I'd forgotten that until recently. He died quietly in December of 1886, in his bed, with Gertrude holding his hand and Abraham sitting in the chair by the window and Eli, who had been brought in because he asked to come, and they saw no reason to refuse him, asleep across the foot of the bed. It was a peaceful death, which the doctor confirmed, and which the family felt in the quality of the silence he left. They buried him beside his wife, Margaret, in the ranch's small family burial ground east of the house, under the live oaks. The whole county came, because Elias Beckett had been a fixture in Harlan County for 35 years, and people knew what they were saying goodbye to. Delia Calhoun stood very straight. Ruth and Calvin Morrison came. Henderson came from Austin again, because he had met Elias twice and considered him a man worth honoring. Gertrude spoke briefly at the graveside, clearly and without breaking, and said that her father had built something real on this land and had taught her by example that the thing you built with your hands and your life was worth protecting completely. Abraham stood beside her the whole time, which was the entire thing she needed. Spring returned the way it always did, with the wildflowers first and then the heat, and the ranch absorbed them the way the ranch always absorbed everything, with the particular steady continuousness of land that exists beyond individual human seasons. Eli turned 5 and asked for a horse of his own, which was a reasonable request from a ranch child of that age, and Abraham selected a small steady mare that would not easily frighten, a gray with a kind eye, and Eli named her Silver without any hesitation. The riding lessons conducted in the East Pasture every Saturday morning were a matter of considerable joy to everyone present, including Dex, who watched from the fence with an expression of approval, and Julio, who took it upon himself to teach the boy some basic Spanish vocabulary while teaching him to groom the horse. Gertrude watched from the pasture gate one Saturday morning in late spring, and felt something so completely whole inside her that she stopped and just stood with it for a moment, the specific weight and texture of a life that had come together correctly from materials that had individually seemed insufficient. A forged deed had started it. A forgery she had caught by knowing more than anyone expected her to know, which was, in retrospect, the story of her life. She thought about that sometimes, about the specific arithmetic of it. A man had ridden into her yard with a scheme designed to steal from her family, and she had turned it inside out, and in the process had discovered that the man himself was something different from the scheme he was carrying, something worth the difficulty of finding. She had found Henderson and the 4 families and the legal documentation and the Attorney General's case in Escobedo, and the settlement for Abraham's mother's land, and the office built with afternoon light, and all the land titles she had helped preserve for people who could not have done it alone. She had found all of it because she had known what to look for in a forged document and had decided to understand the full shape of the thing before she acted. Abraham came to the fence beside her, Eli having been handed off to Julio for the grooming portion of the lesson. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking," she said. "You're thinking about something specific," he said. "You have the particular look." "What look?" "The look where you're measuring something," he said, "calculating dimensions." She looked at him sideways. "When did you learn to read me that well?" "I've been watching you closely for approximately 3 years," he said. "I have learned some of the language." "Only some," she said. "The rest is still teaching me," he said. She put her hand through his arm, which was their casual, habitual gesture, the one that said everything that daily love says when it has moved past demonstration and into simply being. "I'm thinking about how things connect," she said, "the deed and where it led." "To here," he said. "To here," she agreed, "which is exactly where I intend to be." He looked at her with that quality of complete attention, the same attention he had given her since the morning she had stood at his kitchen table, across the table from a man who had tried to deceive her family, and was in the process of becoming the most important person in her life. "I want another child," she said. He looked at her. Not with surprise exactly, but with a particular quality of directness that was his version of strong feeling made visible. When, he said, "In the general future," she said, "I am not announcing a fact, I am stating a preference." "That is a preference I share completely," he said. A son arrived in the summer of 1888 whom they named James. He was loud and solid and had Gertrude's coloring and Abraham's temperament, which was to say he was observant and quiet for a baby, watching everything with wide, dark eyes that seemed to be cataloging the world. Eli received his brother with the particular mixture of possessiveness and curiosity that 7-year-olds bring to new people, decided within a week that James was acceptable, and by the end of the month had appointed himself James's primary protector, a role he took seriously. In 1889, the state of Wyoming admitted women to the practice of law in territorial courts, which Gertrude read about in the Austin Statesman with the specific quality of attention she gave to things that implied a future direction. Texas was not Wyoming. Texas was not going to change this year or perhaps for many years, but things changed, and the record of change was important. She kept reading. She kept writing to Henderson, who had been promoted within the land office and who continued to answer every question she sent. She helped 14 families with deed and title questions in 1889, charging nothing and accepting what was offered, which was sometimes money and sometimes preserved fruit, and sometimes a repaired fence section, all of which she found equally acceptable. Abraham won a cattle award at the county fair in Harlan Springs in 1889, presented by the County Agricultural Society for breeding excellence, which he accepted with his characteristic quietness, and which the county celebrated with the warmth it reserved for achievements that had genuine practical benefit to the community. Dex attended the ceremony and was visibly proud in a way he would have categorically denied if asked. Julio brought his wife and 3 of his children. The ranch grew. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, and with the particular quality of growth that comes from consistent attention and honest work. They bought the adjacent 40 acres when Old Man Peters died without heirs and his land went to auction, because the water rights connected to the creek were worth the investment. They improved the bunkhouse. They built a proper water tank at the east pasture. They replaced the south fence posts with cedar, which Abraham did without comment, but with a quality of satisfaction that Gertrude found entirely endearing. In the evenings they sat on the porch when the weather allowed, the way Elias and Abraham had once sat, and they talked about the day and the week and the plans and the past, and sometimes they sat in silence that was comfortable in the specific way of silence between people who have run out of the need to explain themselves to each other. Eli grew into a serious boy who loved horses and cattle and had his mother's appetite for reading, which he applied to everything available, including Gertrude's law texts, which he read at 11 with a concentration that she recognized, and which she answered as she always had, by explaining everything he asked about. He asked about the vast case which he had heard about in fragments over the years, and she told him the full story, the deed, the forgery, the testimony, the indictment, the conviction. "How did you know the deed was fake?" he asked. "The paper was wrong," she said, "and the abbreviations were wrong by a decade, and the baseline marker was wrong for a 1849 survey of that specific terrain." He thought about this. "You knew all that because you had studied it." "Yes," she said. "Because nobody else was going to," he said, with the directness of a child who has been listening to adult conversation for 11 years. "That was part of it," she said. "Also because it interested me." "You learn most deeply the things that interest you." He thought about this more. "What did Father do when he found out you knew?" She smiled, looking out at the ridge. "He asked me how long I had known. And you said, since the moment he put it on the table." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Was that when you decided to help him?" Gertrude looked at her son, this serious 11-year-old with his father's dark eyes and his own particular quality of attention, and she said, "I decided to understand the full shape of it first. The decision to help him came from what I understood." Eli nodded slowly, in a way that said he was filing this away under things that mattered. James was 4.5 and currently trying to teach Silver the mare to perform a trick he had invented, which involved the horse lowering her head on command, a project that Julio had been called in to assist with, and that was showing some progress. Abraham was watching this from the pasture fence with the particular expression of a father who is proud of multiple aspects of a situation simultaneously. Gertrude went and stood beside him. "He's going to convince her to do it," Abraham said. "He is," she agreed. "He has your patience. He has your logic," Abraham said. "He figured out that she'll lower her head for the right food reward. He's been testing which food." "Scientific method," Gertrude said. "He is 4, Abraham said. "He is 4 and has good instincts," she said. "The instincts can be refined." Abraham put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the small, comfortable amount that fit them together, and they watched James and Julio and the mare in the late afternoon light of the Texas summer, with the ridge behind the pasture going gold the way it always did at this hour, and the live oaks moving in the warm wind, and the cattle moving in the far distance, steady and sound. The land was theirs. It had always been theirs, built by her father's hands and her mother's endurance and her own sustained intelligence and the work of everyone who had come through it. A forged deed had tried to take it, and she had seen the forgery before it could land, and what she had found in the aftermath was everything she was standing in now. Abraham tightened his arm around her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at the ridge and the light on it, the same light she had watched her whole life, the same specific quality of gold that no other light was quite like. "That everything connected," she said. "That I am exactly where I intended to be." He pressed his lips to her temple, warm and steady, the way he was. "So am I," he said. Finally. She put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder, and they stood together in the light until James came running across the pasture with the news that Silver had lowered her head twice on command, and Julio said she was definitely learning, and they both turned to receive this information with the full attention and celebration it clearly deserved. The ridge went gold and then amber and then the deep rose of the best evenings, and the Beckett Morgan ranch settled into its evening sounds, the cattle calling, the horses in the paddock, the supper smells from the kitchen where Eli had taken it upon himself to start the stove tonight, which would produce a result of uncertain quality but genuine effort. James was in Abraham's arms now, tired from the afternoon's equine science, talking still, always talking, his words running together with the particular energy of a child for whom the day has been very full. Gertrude stood in the yard of her father's ranch, which was her ranch, which was their ranch, and looked at the people in it, and felt the particular piece of a life that had been built correctly from materials that had seemed, at one point, like only a threat. The drifter had come to sell her family their own land. He had not succeeded at that. He had succeeded at something else entirely, something neither of them had planned, something that had turned out to be the truest and most permanent thing either of them had ever been part of. The stars came out over Harlan County, the way they had every night since before anyone had been there to see them, and the ranch was alive and whole and theirs. And inside the house Eli burned the biscuits slightly and nobody minded, and James fell asleep in his father's arms, and Gertrude Beckett Morgan lit the lamp in her office and wrote one more letter to Henderson about a neighbor's title question. And Abraham came and stood in the doorway with the lamp behind him and the night behind him, and looked at her desk in her office with the particular expression she had come to understand was what love looked like, long and committed and daily and completely real. She looked up. "Come to bed," he said. She capped her pen and folded the letter. She would finish it in the morning. There was always morning on land that was yours. "Yes," she said, and stood up and put out the lamp and went home.